A dairy farm turned out to be a classic South African fraud. Prosecutors say millions of dollars from state coffers, meant to uplift the poor, vanished in a web of bank accounts controlled by politically connected companies and individuals. Joao Silva, the New York Times VREDE, South Africa, with loudspeakers blaring, city officials drove across the black township's dirt roads in a pickup truck, summoning residents to the town hall. The main guest was a local figure who had soared up the ranks of the governing African National Congress and come back with an enticing offer. Over the next few hours, the visiting political boss, Mosbanzi Joseph Swain, sold them on his latest deal, a government-backed dairy farm that they, as landless black farmers, would control. They would get an ownership stake in the business just by signing up. They would go to India for training, all expenses paid. To hear him tell it, the dairy would bring jobs to the impoverished, help build a clinic and fix the roads. He said he wanted to change our lives, said Ephraim Dlamini, who, despite suspicions that the offer was too good to be true, signed up to become a beneficiary of the project. This thing is coming from the government, free of charge. You can't say you don't like this thing. You must take it. But, sure enough, his instincts were right. The dairy farm turned out to be a classic South African fraud. Prosecutors say millions of dollars from state coffers, meant to uplift the poor, vanished in a web of bank accounts controlled by politically connected companies and individuals. The money from an array of state contracts like this one helped pay for a lavish wedding that a top executive at KPMG, the international accounting firm, described as an event of the millennium, according to leaked emails. And Mr. Swain, continuing his meteoric rise, soon leapt to the national stage to become South Africa's Minister of Mineral Resources. Almost nothing trickled down to the township or the scores of would-be beneficiaries after that first meeting in 2012. The only local residents to get a free trip to India were members of a church choir headed by Mr. Swain. In the generation since apartheid ended in 1994, tens of billions of dollars in public funds, intended to develop the economy and improve the lives of black South Africans, have been siphoned off by leaders of the ANC, the very organization that had promised them a new, equal and just nation. Corruption has enriched ANC leaders and their business allies, black and white South Africans, as well as foreigners. But the supposed beneficiaries of many government projects, in whose names the money was spent, have been left with little but seething anger and deepening disillusionment with the state of post-apartheid South Africa. While poverty has declined since the end of apartheid, inequality has risen in a society that was already one of the world's most unequal, according to a recent report by the World Bank and the South African government. South Africa has a large, advanced economy, an aggressively free press and a wealth of independent organizations and scholars who keep a close watch on government malfeasance. But even with its vibrant democracy, in which the details of corruption schemes are routinely aired and condemned by the news media and opposition politicians, graft has engulfed the country. Jacob Zuma, Center, the former president of South Africa, appeared in court in Durban this month for a hearing on corruption charges. Felix Dilanga Mandela, Agence France Presse, Getty Images. The nation was governed for 9 years by the scandal-plagued President Jacob Zuma, whose close ties with the Gupta family, 3 Indian brothers at the helm of a sprawling business empire built on government contracts, including the dairy farm, outraged voters. Their cozy relationship contributed to the ANC's recent electoral losses and helped lead to Mr. Zuma's ouster 2 months ago. Promising a new dawn, Mr. Zuma's replacement, Cyril Ramaphosa, has said that he would make fighting corruption a priority as the nation's new president. But he is also a veteran ANC insider, and the early signs have not been encouraging. Having become party leader by a razor-thin margin, Mr. Ramaphosa has tried to keep together a fractured ANC. By moving cautiously, he formed his first cabinet by appointing some well-respected officials, but also include allies, his own and Mr. Zuma's, who have been accused of corruption by the Public Protector's Office and good governance groups. Beyond that, politicians who long oversaw provinces rife with public corruption, including the one where the dairy farm is, now sit at the top of the ANC's hierarchy. National prosecutors, often criticized for being servile to the sitting president, say they are trying to recover more than $4 billion lost to corruption related to the Gupta family's undue influence on Mr. Zuma's administration. And that is just a small measure of the corruption that has whittled away at virtually every institution in the country, including schools, public housing, the police, the power utility, South African Airways and state enterprises overseeing everything from rail service to the defense industry. Almost no one comes out of this looking good. At just under $21 million, the money lost in the VREDE dairy farm may seem small. But it is a big test of whether South Africa's new government has the power and the will to confront public corruption at its source. The police have apprehended some low and mid-level officials involved in the dairy farm, the first arrests related to a high-profile case of public corruption during the Zuma presidency. But notably, they have yet to pursue any NC. MRC Wayne has not faced any charges. What's more, the provincial premier who approved the project, Ace Magashule, was recently elected Secretary-General of the ANC, elevating him to the top ranks of the party's leadership. The endless scandals have also raised serious questions about the complicity of major Western companies, with multiple investigations scrutinizing the role they may have played in enabling corruption and weakening the country's institutions. South African regulators have urged the police to begin a criminal inquiry into McKinsey, the American consulting giant, over its relationship with a Gupta-linked company and a contract involving a state-owned utility. A South African court has frozen the $83 million McKinsey was paid for the contract, and the firm says it will return the fee. Regulators say they have also pressed the police to investigate KPMG, the Big Four auditing firm based in the Netherlands, for its work for the National Revenue Service in 2015. KPMG has acknowledged that elements of the work should no longer be relied upon, and offered to pay back its consulting fees. SAP, the German software behemoth, is being investigated by the United States Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission after it disclosed payments to intermediaries on state contracts that may have contravened the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. International banks have been ensnared in the scandals, too. HSBC and Standard Chartered have been accused by a British lawmaker of laundering the Gupta's ill-gotten gains. HSBC says it has closed a number of accounts that belonged to front companies operated by the Gupta family. A statue of Nelson Mandela in Pretoria. While Mr. Mandela is still revered in the West, his legacy is regarded more harshly in South Africa, especially by young blacks. Daniel Barahuluk for the New York Times. Many trace the deep corruption in the nation to a fundamental flaw in South Africa's transition from white rule to democracy a generation ago. In the grand bargain struck between the apartheid government and the ANC, headed by Nelson Mandela, a transfer of power was carried out peacefully, disproving predictions of civil war and earning Mr. Mandela accolades as a visionary peacemaker. But the deal was reached on what many South Africans today consider Pyrrhic terms. The black majority was allowed to control politics, but much of the country's economic resources, including land, has remained in the hands of white South Africans and a small group of other elites. In the early years of ANC rule, Mr. Mandela and other top leaders, who had helped defeat apartheid but had no personal savings, received houses, vehicles and money from white business leaders, essentially bribes, critics say. A smattering of influential figures, like the current president, Mr. Ramaphosa, amassed extraordinary wealth. They were allowed to buy shares of white-owned companies on extremely generous terms and invited to sit on corporate boards. They acted as conduits between the governing party and the white-dominated business world. Some of the ANC leaders who were left out of that bonanza quickly found a new road to wealth: lucrative government contracts. The public cap became a legitimate source of wealth for the well-connected, but also a wellspring of corruption and political patronage, much as it had been for the white minority during apartheid. Over the years, Mr. Zuma and his allies, while never admitting corruption, often played down its corrosive effect on society and emphasized the need to redistribute wealth to black South Africans. It is an argument that Mr. Zuma is expected to make in defending himself against recently reinstated charges of corruption in an arms deal from the late 1990s. Mandela is still revered in the West. His legacy is regarded more critically in South Africa, especially by some young black people. To them, he sold out the country's black masses to the white business elite. Even some of Mr. Mandela's longtime supporters struggle to defend the deal that he struck to bring democracy to South Africa. Ultimately, it left most black people in poverty while benefiting a small elite, including the chief negotiator during the talks, Mr. Ramaphosa. After 27 years as a political prisoner, Mr. Mandela did not understand South Africa's political economy and agreed to a settlement that failed to secure black South Africans' economic independence, said Mamphela Ramphele, an anti-apartheid activist who became close to Mr. Mandela. She later went on to serve as a managing director of the World Bank. He didn't know any better, Ms. Ramphele said. Workers building a house in Mbalio, a township that borders VREDE in Free State. In many townships in South Africa, the level of local corruption can be quickly gauged by the quality of government housing for the poor. Joao Silva, The New York Times. The dairy farm case is emblematic of the many ills afflicting South Africa a quarter-century after the end of apartheid. It shows how corruption, in a government controlled at all levels by a single party, has entrenched old racial inequalities. About 125 miles southeast of Johannesburg, in the province of Free State, VREDE is a small farming town with discount chain stores, 2 supermarkets, and a gas station. A cemetery and a police station, buffers during the apartheid era, still separate VREDE from the neighboring black township of Mandela. As in so many other townships, the level of local corruption can be quickly gauged by the quality of government housing for the poor. In one of the most common sources of corruption, money and building materials are diverted from a housing project, often leaving behind shoddy dwellings for poor residents who have waited years or decades to move out of shacks. In a new outpost of the township, single-family government houses were so poorly built that many have collapsed, while new houses are being erected on shaky foundations and frames, with deep cracks spreading across extremely thin walls. In many ways, the area is a microcosm of the enduring economic imbalance in South Africa. Nationally, black people make up 80% of the population, but most remain shut out of economic opportunities. White people, accounting for 8%, retain an oversized influence on the economy. Nearly all of the commercial farmers around VREDE are white, as is the main government contractor. In the adjoining township, black people operate small taverns and basic car washes. But in the town of VREDE itself, white people still own all of the faded buildings on the main street, where they, along with immigrants from other African nations in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, operate shops. Black people, who are not allowed to live in the town under apartheid, now own or rent only about 10% of its residences. VREDE is a small farming town with discount chain stores, 2 supermarkets, and a gas station. There is only one store in town operated by black South Africans. Joao Silva, The New York Times. This system that was built for us, blacks, it's very difficult for us to create our own businesses, said Velithulani Tishabalala, 29, who runs a computer and cell phone repair shop with his cousin. They are the only black South Africans to operate a store in VREDE. Peter Burge, 83, a white South African who served on VREDE's city council in the years immediately before and after the end of apartheid, agreed that little has changed for black South Africans since 1994 and that the economic inequality has remained static. They only received the power to vote, that was all. Mr. Burge said, adding that he definitely considered that a historical mistake. In the late 1990s, officials were purged from city government and replaced by NC appointees with little experience. The purge, which occurred at all levels of government across the nation, contributed to the corruption that emerged toward the end of Mr. Mandela's term. Here in Free State, one of the first post-apartheid cases of corruption in government revolved around Mr. Magashule, the ANC's current Secretary-General. Mr. Magashule, now 59, has served as the party's leader in Free State since the very end of apartheid in 1994. He grew up in Heirs, a small town in the province. During apartheid, he was an underground ANC operative whose boldness caught the attention of Winnie Mandela, Nelson's wife and an anti-apartheid activist. After white rule ended, he oversaw economic development in the cabinet of the first post-apartheid provincial premier, Mosiuoa Lakota. In an interview, Mr. Lakota said he had caught Mr. Magashule stealing government funds, a charge that Mr. Magashule, whose spokespeople did not respond to interview requests for this article, has long denied. Mr. Lakota said he had fired Mr. Magashule, but was overruled by his patron, the ANC's Deputy Secretary-General at the time, Mr. Zuma. Magashule, the African National Congress Secretary-General, has served as the party's leader in Free State since the end of apartheid in 1994. Joao Silva, The New York Times. In the early days after the end of apartheid, Mr. Zuma openly complained about the ANC leaders who were getting rich. Most, like Mr. Ramaphosa and Tokyo Sex Whale, another anti-apartheid activist, were favorites of Mr. Mandela. Zuma did go to some of the other guys and said to them, "This is what Mandela is doing. We must wake up and we must go for the money ourselves," said Mr. Lakota, who left the ANC to found his own party, the Congress of the People, in 2008. Mr. Magashule went on to flourish inside Free State. He became premier of the province in 2009 just as Mr. Zuma became president. Like other powerful premiers, he was able to turn his province into a fief, said Mr. Lakota and several provincial officials from the ANC, as well as its historical ally, the South African Communist Party. Texas taxes are mostly collected by the national government, and the money is redistributed to the provinces, where it is spent with little oversight. Free State, a rural economy where black people remain dependent on the ANC for jobs and government contracts, has remained a stronghold for the party even as it has lost support among middle-class black voters in urban areas. Mr. Magashawal's ambitions, however, were never confined to the province. Like Mr. Zuma, he forged a relationship with the Gupta brothers, who had befriended some high-ranking ANC figures after arriving in South Africa from their native India in the early 1990s. Mr. Magashawal's son, Tisha Biso, worked for the Guptas, and, according to emails leaked from a Gupta company server, served as a conduit to his father's office. Under Mr. Magashawal's governance, many of the province's public services departments teetered on the brink of insolvency, according to ANC officials and opposition parties. In a harsh report in 2017, the national auditor said that Free State's government showed a lack of accountability and commitment towards clean administration, adding that the situation had worsened in recent years. If you find that the one who is supposed to be the custodian of the purse, like the premier, he is the one who is involved in corrupt practices, it becomes easy then for others also to get involved, said Thabo Manyoni, an ANC official in Free State who was once a close friend and deputy of Mr. Magashawal. You end up in a situation where nobody is able to stop anyone else because we all are doing it, Mr. Manyoni said. The dairy farm in VREDE, part of a corruption case that has fanned outrage across South Africa. Joao Silva of the New York Times: to many, the dairy farm project appeared to be a swindle from the beginning. For starters, there were ample suspicions about the pitchman, Mr. Swain. I know this guy, said Mr. Delimini, the would-be beneficiary who was also the chairman of VREDE's arm of the African Farmers Association, a national organization for black farmers. I don't trust him. As he climbed the political ranks, Mr. Swain often came back to the Mbaliel, the black township next to VREDE. Sometimes, he doled out fistfuls of cash from the trunk of his latest luxury car, said ANC and opposition politicians, as well as many residents. Throughout the township and town, many people shared the same wariness of Mr. Swain. His meteoric rise had been too fast and seemed tied to the corruption taking hold in the ANC and in Free State. Mr. Swain, who declined through a spokesman to comment for this article, grew up on a nearby farm and moved to the Mbaliel in his teens. People remember him as an undistinguished student who, after high school, taught the children of black farm laborers in a nearby village where he met his future wife. The couple lived next to the school building, in a low, two-room concrete structure that is still used as a schoolteacher's residence. There, villagers remember Mr. Swain as an engaged teacher, at least until he became a district councillor and his interests turned to politics. Soon, Mr. Swain rose swiftly in the party, as well as in local and district governments, thanks in great part to his close relationship with the province's head of the ANC, Mr. Magashawal, according to politicians in Free State. He joined Mr. Magashawal's cabinet in 2009 and a few years later took over the agriculture portfolio. When Mr. Swain became the provincial minister of agriculture, many black farmers in VREDE rejoiced. Like others in the country, they had neither capital nor land. With a local son heading the province's Department of Agriculture, they thought their lives were going to change, recalled Meshach Nkongwane, the deputy chairman of VREDE's African Farmers Association. A dozen black farmers from VREDE chartered a bus, each paying about $20, to attend Mr. Swain's swearing-in ceremony in the provincial capital, Bloemfontein, about 4 hours away. Even the association's chairman, the skeptical Mr. Delimini, went along. South Africa's Minister of Mineral Resources, Mosbanzi Joseph Swain, left touring a gold mine in 2015. As Free State's agriculture minister, he said the dairy farm project would empower black farmers and create 150 jobs. Waldo Sweegers, Bloomberg, we were happy, Mr. Nkongwane said, adding, in hindsight, although we were happy for a crook, in 2012, Mr. Swain and agricultural department officials arrived in VREDE to promote the dairy farm project. Flanked by the council speaker, Roseline Swain, known as Topsy, who happened to be his wife, and by his longtime ally, Mayor Tilakatsi John Motong, Mr. Swain told the crowd about a dairy farm that would empower black farmers and create 150 jobs. Shortly afterward, his department signed the first of its 2 dairy farm agreements with a company called Estina. This was a peculiar choice. Estina was to buy cows for local farmers and process milk at the farm. But the company was headed by a businessman from India who had a background in information technology, not in farming. Yet, importantly, he had long worked for the Guptas. Despite the project's sketchy details, Mr. Swain signed off on it and asked the provincial treasury to start paying Estina, according to an investigation by the National Treasury. Initially, he was overruled by lawyers in Mr. McGoshawal's office, who deemed the contract invalid because procurement rules, like a competitive bid, had not been followed. But that was only a hiccup. The province signed another contract with Estina the following month, this time with the lawyer's blessing. That agreement stated that Estina would invest just under $20 million in the project and the province would contribute about $30 million over 3 years. Local farmers, the so-called beneficiaries, would retain 51% of the shares. There was something fishy from the start, said Dr. VREDE, who was a councillor for the opposition Democratic Alliance in VREDE. MRZ Wayne and the agricultural officials presented no business plan or budget for the project, but they and the mayor insisted on pressing ahead, Mr. VREDE said. The local municipality quickly decided to hand over 3,400 hectares, or about 8,400 acres, of land for the dairy farm. In fact, the municipality was so determined to get the project underway that it compensated 4 white commercial farmers, who had been leasing the land for about $80,000 a year, in order to prematurely break their leases. Later that year, just before Mr. Swain and his local choir left for India, on a trip sponsored by a Gupta company, the province leased the farm to Estina, rent-free, for 99 years. In an interview, Mayor Motong said, "We had no doubt that the plan will work," but the mayor acknowledged that Mr. Swain presented no detailed plan or document about the proposed dairy farm. Even basic details, like the criteria for selecting the beneficiaries, were missing, the mayor said, acknowledging that his role in the project was now under scrutiny. The payments to Estina began months later. Court documents show that the province deposited just under $21 million into Estina bank accounts over 3 years. Days after every payment, the company transferred the entire sum to other accounts. From there, prosecutors say, the money was withdrawn by individuals and other Gupta-linked companies that had little to do with the farm. In fact, prosecutors say that only about 1% of the money invested by the province actually went into dairy farming. Beyond that, the National Treasury found no evidence that Estina ever invested its own money in the project, despite its obligation to do so. Emails leaked from a Gupta company server indicate that some of the money was sent to the United Arab Emirates and put into accounts registered to the Guptas. The money then made its way back to South Africa through a maze of bank transfers, according to spreadsheets, logs and an invoice in the email trove. The emails, amounting to thousands of exchanges, were leaked last year to South African news organizations and an anti-corruption group. It is not known who leaked them, though they soon fanned national outrage at the Gupta family and at Mr. Zuma. The Guptas denied the authenticity of the emails, but some ANC officials included in the correspondence confirmed that they were real. In one of the emails, Gupta companies paid one another for expenses at a relative's lavish 4-day wedding in 2013, including fireworks, dancers, chocolates and scarves. In another exchange, KPMG, then an auditor of the Gupta companies, ignored a junior employee's protest and allowed the Gupta family to write off some of the expenses at the wedding as business costs. "I have never been to an event like that." Moses K. Gosana, a KPMG executive who attended the wedding, gushed to a Gupta brother in one of the emails, calling it an event of the millennium. The accounting firm has since acknowledged that its actions fell well short of the quality expected. Many of the problems surrounding the dairy farm could have been ignored had the province not tried to tap into a national fund for struggling farmers. The national government initially agreed to give about $4 million to the project on the condition that the province submit, among other things, a list of 100 poor farmers who would benefit from the farm. When the government found no evidence that local farmers were involved, it sent National Treasury auditors to investigate in 2013. Though Mr. Swain, sometimes accompanied by his wife, had held meetings to look for beneficiaries, no official list had been drawn. Ephraim Delimini arriving with livestock at an auction in VREDE. He said he was suspicious of the dairy farm project from the start. Joao Silva, the New York Times. After the auditors started asking questions, a list of beneficiaries, between 80 and 100, depending on the version, was hastily assembled. Some were genuine farmers. Others, they are not even farmers, Mr. VREDE said, adding that many were ANC supporters. They don't even have a cat. Estina did try its hand at dairy farming in VREDE. When the National Treasury's investigators visited in 2013, they found about 350 cows and some buildings under construction. But the seemingly inflated costs, including $215,000 for a manually sliding gate in a guardhouse, drew scrutiny from the opposition party. And while the beneficiaries were supposedly the farm's owners, they were never informed of the project's developments. They were not even allowed to visit the premises. Those who were serious about farming started to complain. At a meeting with officials in the provincial government, Mr. Delimini and Mr. Nkongwayne, of the African Farmers Association, said that when they raised questions about the project, they were dismissed as noisy frogs. That especially stung Mr. Delimini, who once was the only black South African business owner in VREDE. He ran a small record store called Siyathuthuka, or We Are Moving Forward, in the Zulu language, but was forced to shutter his store because of rising rents. He was now focused full-time on farming and owned 35 cows. In early 2014, the National Treasury sent a scathing report to Mr. Mikashule, the Premier of Free State, and told the province to stop paying Estina. But it took Free State another 6 months to take the farm back. The province even continued to pay Estina another $11 million after officially terminating the contract, court documents show. Willie Basone, right, is the main government contractor in VREDE and helped build the dairy farm. He said the business was so badly mismanaged that he ended up having to dig graves for as many as 100 cows. Joao Silva, the New York Times. In the end, a project meant to empower black farmers like Mr. Delimini further enriched the Guptas and one of the wealthiest white men in VREDE, Willie Basone. With a fleet of vehicles, construction equipment and billboards advertising his business all over town, Mr. Basone is the main government contractor in VREDE and helped build the dairy farm. But he said that Estina mismanaged the business so badly that he ended up having to dig graves for as many as 100 cows, even though he had delivered feed for them. They just do projects like this to get money, he said in an interview in his office. That's how they operate, but, luckily, they paid me every cent. Mr. Basone said. Hey, it's rotten in this place here, he exclaimed, pounding on the table in front of him. And we work with all of them, so we know. And Iziwa Malaba outside her home in Warden. Her father, Vusi Malaba, a member of the Democratic Alliance who spoke out against corruption in Free State, was gunned down nearby. Joao Silva, the New York Times. It was a measure of how corrupt South Africa had become a generation after the end of apartheid that nothing was done about the VREDE dairy farm case for years. The national police and prosecutors looked away even after the National Treasury raised alarms about the project. In Free State, some who spoke out against public corruption were suddenly killed in circumstances that, even in a country with widespread violent crime, aroused suspicions. Moses T. Sheikh, a provincial government auditor who inquired about projects in the Agriculture Department, was killed in a carjacking in 2013. In Warden, a town where Mr. Swain has a large home, Vusi Malaba, a politician who had campaigned against corruption in public housing, was fatally shot a dozen times just outside his home in 2016. Police investigations resulted in no arrests in either case. As for Mr. Swain, the dairy farm hardly hurt his career. During Mr. Zuma's presidency, the Gupta brothers increasingly acquired economic and political influence by forging close ties with the president, his son and political allies like Mr. Mikashule, the provincial premier who endorsed the dairy farm project. A lawyer for Atul Gupta, from whom prosecutors tried to recover public money spent on the dairy farm, did not respond to a request for an interview with his client. The Gupta's influence, and possibly direct role, in the appointment of ministers and other important government officials has been investigated by the public protector and is expected to be a focus of a recently begun government inquiry into public corruption. In August 2015, according to the leaked emails, Tony Gupta, the youngest of the three brothers, forwarded Mr. Swain's resume to Duduzane Zuma, one of the president's sons, who was a director of many companies operated by the Guptas. 2 months later, Mr. Swain, whose highest qualification is a teacher's diploma,